Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Welcome to the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. So what I'll be trying to do is briefly talk about a few things that the UAE in general is looking at relating to the future. I work at the, as mentioned, at the Dubai Future Foundation. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be sharing, I would say, just trying to open the doors to what the future may hold. This is not something that will happen. It is one of the many things that could happen. And we are seeing its developments and many of its seeds being implanted today around the world and even in the region. So as mentioned, these are going to be sort of points of view relating to the future. And we'll be covering 5 sort of mega trends. And just the definition on mega trends, these are trends, changes, developments that are happening. And the reason why they're called mega trends is that each of these separate trends can be divided and narrowed down into 15 to 20 more trends in them. So what you see here is we focused on sort of 2, there's the dividing line. We have 2 that we're looking at that are global scale trends that are happening all around the world and that are impacting every person on this planet. And then we have these 3 here. And the reason why we're interested in them is because we are seeing a vacuum to some extent in the region or even around the world when we talk about its development. And as a result, we believe that the UAE has the ability to not only contribute, but play a leading role, whether it was in the conversation and discussions relating to that, or even regarding how it is being developed and try to play a role in that. So let's go into it. So the first is climate change. And what we know about climate change is that it's something that is going to affect us all, primarily the generations to come. And what we are seeing today is that this development is going to happen much faster than we expected. And last year in November, December, the United Nations came out with a report saying that we have 12 years to limit the rise in temperature from to 2 degrees. Now, what 2 degrees mean is, so it's the average global temperature being 2 degrees or over Celsius. Now, so when we look at it more on a localized version, if in a scenario that the world reaches 2 degrees Celsius above what we're seeing today, we're going to see some parts of the world, their temperatures are going to increase to 15, 20 degrees. And in other parts of the world, it's going to decrease, maybe 20, 30 degrees. Because at the end of the day, we are living in a closed system. And as a result, things and laws of physics try to get us to equal and try to get us to reach that equilibrium. So when the scale is imbalanced somewhere, there needs to happen something on the other end to offset that change. But why are we looking at climate change as one of these trends that will impact our future? And I'll do that with all of the separate trends where we'll talk a bit about it, and then I'll give you a bit of the evidence that are supporting the reason why we're doing it. So here we go. So we're noticing that since 1980, the number of floods have quadrupled. This is 1980. This is 40 years. So we're not talking centuries and hundreds of years. We're talking now. And more importantly, it has doubled since 2004. So we're seeing it doubling from 1980 to 2004, and then in 14, 15 years, it doubled even more. And this is quite scary. where we are seeing this development already happening on a global scale. The number of these floods, hurricanes, and so on and so forth is happening. Not just they're recurring much faster, but even the impact and the severity of these events are happening much stronger, harsher, year on year. Another thing is, so in the past 10 years, last year was the first year in which poverty has increased as a direct result of climate change. Where we're seeing, because of an increase of droughts somewhere in the world, that there isn't a lot of farming, there isn't a lot of harvest, and at the other end, we're having parts of the world, and sometime in the same continent, where there is at one end or west of a continent, and if we take, for example, Africa, where we have one end, there's extreme drought. On the other end of that continent, we're seeing extreme floods. So there isn't enough time for harvest to grow, for people to be able to come up with food, and for governments to be able to provide this to the people who need it the most. And ultimately, when we look at climate change, the people who will be impacted the most are those on the border or on the line and even below the poverty line. And these are the people who ultimately the structure, the infrastructure, the policies, the governance structures are not there to protect them, specifically speaking about climate change. And finally, and this is, we've spoken about this on a global scale, 95% of scientists agree that the 12-year mark that I mentioned earlier, given by the United Nations, will not happen. We will not be able to reach or try to mitigate that increase in climate. So we know this is going to happen to some extent. There is this scientific consensus that this is going to happen. What can we do now? And ultimately, what we're trying to do is, I won't be giving you answers, and even at our work at the foundation is not to give you answers, but to try to raise questions, try to have conversations going, and ultimately try to get to a point where we understand what we want as a desired outcome. So when it comes to climate change, we know that we need to have radical responses from a government perspective, from startup perspective. So some may say we need to 10x climate change response and climate change urgency. So next, we're seeing social change. In this country alone, we've seen dramatic, significant social change that has happened. There are efforts to maintain the tradition, but there are some changes that have happened, and specifically when we talk about technology. And the example I like to give is, historically, people would feel that they belong to a tribe or to a single family, from a single family to a larger tribe, from a larger tribe, as people became more indulged and more into creating their own society, they started to belong to a neighborhood or to a farij. To some extent, that is the UAE culture still there. And then from a farij to an emirate, and then to a nation in the UAE. And that's a progression that we've seen here, at least in the region to some extent, and in many developing countries. So when we talk about some belongings that are happening today, where people feel the same connection that they do to their country or to their families with virtual societies, or to those particularly in the gaming community, where there are many different hypothetical scenarios that are happening, where we're seeing that if we try to convince people to do something over a video game, we're seeing that impact happen in real life. Or we're seeing that as a community, whether it was the recent efforts in terms of trying to clean up beaches and forests in developing nations started with online virtual communities coming together for an impact on a more physical and tangible aspect. So what evidence suggests this change is happening, or what can we do about it? So here we go. We're seeing the rise of third culture kids. And for those of you living in the UAE, you may be a third culture kid without even knowing it. So even when we raise this question for the UAE, is this an opportunity? We've never thought of it, but could this be an opportunity? Could this be a challenge? We don't know. And ultimately, this discussion needs to happen. There needs to be a dialogue that has happened on a societal level and on a government level, where we're saying, all right, we're having people that are from all around the world. They are here in the UAE, and some of them feel this belonging to the UAE. What can we do about it? And then when we look at sort of adapting technologies in the UAE, and the reason why I mentioned this number, where 64% of US adults were asked if they wanted to have implants that will help their memories be injected into their brains, 64% of them said no. And what's interesting about it is, I raise it because I asked this question to a group of Emiratis. If I was to gather the opinions of the Emirati public, or even the UAE, and try to get their reactions regarding this, if I asked them this question, if I were to put an implant or a chip in your brain to help you with your memory. So the people in the room said, yes, we want this, all of them. I'm like, all right, but we don't have a systematic approach to measuring that. All we can do today is go into majlises and try to estimate, all right, a big chunk of this majlis is in agreement, this majlis isn't. So even in terms of collecting data and trying to understand what is our reaction, and more importantly, what is our opinion relating to many trends regarding the future. As a result, so what we see on a larger scale is when one country does something, many different countries follow, without looking at, is this suitable for my applications? Is there a need? And there's a famous quote, I can't recall right now who said it, but who said, if technology is the answer, what was the question? And ultimately, we need to look at many of the different challenges, many of the different situations that we're in, and try to ask that question. Is technology the right answer for it? If so, what is the question we're trying to solve? And finally, with the advancements of artificial limbs, we're seeing an increase in the demand today, and that demand is on an exponential trajectory of artificial limbs. So as artificial limbs are becoming cheaper, Dubai Health Authority 3D printed a leg from the knee down, I think for the price of 1,000 dirhams. 3D printed it, added the mechanics for it. And that technology now is available and people can use it. But when we talk about that specific technology becoming more powerful or more advanced than the natural limbs that we have today, will that demand increase? If so, will people, and this is more of a philosophical question, a theoretical one, would people be willing to disregard their natural limbs for an artificial one? Are we going to see this? Yes or no? We don't know. However, it is something that needs to be discussed, because if that was to be the case, do we have the governance system to at least try to limit the negative impacts of this happening? So as a result, whenever we look at social change and introducing technology into society, we need to make sure that we are choosing ones that are related more closely to our values, and how we can use that technology to either export or to either expand what our values really mean. And now we're going into the trends that we believe we have the opportunity to contribute to and even pioneer in. And so when we talk about AI, notice here work and education. AI is a monster of a I would say a field or a terminology. So saying AI in general is not fair. However, when we look at AI, what we're noticing in the UAE is the focus on education and work. How does AI specifically focus in tackling these two aspects? With the introduction of the advanced skills portfolio by His Excellency, for His Excellency, Dr. Ahmed Bilhol, this is something that he's looking into. And even when we look at education, the ministries of education are looking into how do we put AI into the school curriculum, or should it be placed in there? That question is still being debated, and many different pilot projects have been announced to investigate this aspect. However, whenever we hear anything regarding AI on a global scale, it is more on the Terminator scenario. Arnold Schwarzenegger is gonna be here and he's gonna wreak havoc. But we're trying to look at the positives and how can we maximize the positives in order to negate and limit the negatives that will happen. Ultimately, AI is a tool. We as humans determine whether we use it for good or, la samah Allah, for evil. And just like computers, the same dialogue that we're hearing today, or that AI will take our jobs and automation is going to destroy many things, is a conversation that has been happening for hundreds of years since the first industrial revolution. So it's not new, it's just how do we live with these machines. So what do the numbers say? So please focus on the first sentence, robots helping humans. And this is looking at robots that are assisting humans, whether it was exoskeletons or assistant robotics in factories and things like that. The market share for these types of robotics, and again, I'm not saying all of robotics, just this sliver of the robotics industry will equal to $2.9 trillion market share. Again, this is an opportunity we believe the UAE can and should look into. And we do have the talent for it. The UAE has, so 33% of all workers in the UAE are engineers. In the US, that's 13%. So from a standpoint of talent, we do have a larger amount of talent that has the ability to be able to try to investigate and try to lead and create startups relating to this sector. And another thing that we, as part of the world that's quite close to India, is India graduates 1 million engineers. China has the same number, and these numbers are on the rise, with more job opportunities happening for engineers, for people with technical skills, skills that are relating to the 21st century skills. These numbers will be increasing. And what can we do about it here in the UAE? Can we be that hub for these individuals? And if we are that hub, then how can we retain such talent? And then relating to AI in the educational sector, so this was the pilot project in, if I'm not mistaken, in the US, where they've allowed AI to try to play a part in the curriculum of students, specifically in the math class. And this AI was was programmed by the teacher, or with the supervision of the teacher. And what it did was look at what are the strong points of these students and how it can try to create or have the syllabus work for the strong points of the students and try to personalize, customize the curriculum for each of the students in the class. So ultimately, the teacher becomes a supervisor of the whole class instead of a supervisor or trying to teach every single student differently. So ultimately, what we're seeing here is the teachers having sort of an edge, that advantage, of trying to educate students. And what we noticed, or what the study noticed, was that there was 2 times the amount of knowledge being comprehended by the students in this field. So again, this is something. This is a good indicator in my case as someone who didn't do that well in math. So can we look into this? Is this something we should implement in schools today? And ultimately, what can we, or how can we identify, ultimately, when we talk about AI, how can we identify the sectors and the developments in artificial intelligence that will reap the most rewards for the UAE? And this is the effort that needs to be looked at. It's not that, oh, this is the technology, let's adopt it wholeheartedly. However, what are the different aspects in AI that I can then adopt and I can then implement and try to work as I go regarding trying to experiment with its impact. And finally, just before finally, we're noticing a cutting-edge field of the bioscience and biotechnology, and specifically when we talk about the quantum and biological worlds. We're seeing an exponential rise in biotechnology startups and startups that are focusing on the microscopic level. So when we talk about nano robots or nanotechnology, in science fiction, the idea that you can put a robot that you put in your bloodstream and it can go through your body and try to, whenever you have an inkling of a disease, it tries to kill it. This may sound like science fiction, but the work for it is already happening today. It's already being experimented in labs in Europe as well as in Japan and in the US, but specifically in MIT. And in fact, in the Museum of the Future in Dubai, there will be a quantum computer there that will be running and crunching many of the different theories and formulas and experiments there on the ground. All right, so what we're noticing here is the quantum computers, and for those who, I'm no expert in quantum computing, however, quantum computers, if we look at binary language or the language of computers, it is ones and zeros. What quantum computing does is it allows computers to speak in not just ones and zeros, 1, 0, 2, 3, 4, 5, till 9, as well as in letters in some cases, where in China, computers are using actual letters rather than binary numbers to try to experiment and solve different challenges for computers. So even when we talk about these public key encryptions that are being used by security departments and forces to try to keep hackers at bay, it will gradually no longer be hackers, but computers that are fighting each other. And even when we look at the role of hackers, it will differ. So from the security angle, it's something that needs to be revised as a sector. Another thing is, and to some extent, whenever we talk about autonomous driving and as well as sort of computers with machine learning abilities, we're seeing that they are having, or scientists are creating parts of the human synapses. where Google, that is teaching a robot how to walk, has to look at the human mind and how we walk and try to replicate that for robots. It is not there yet, but it is something that's on the way to happen in the next 20 to 30 years. And finally, when we look at the medical field in particular, we're seeing a rise as well in spending. In the UAE, we have a massive budget for sending people for healthcare. We're seeing that number increasing with the different diseases that are coming up as humans becoming, viruses becoming more immune to antibiotics. And even these advancements are increasing in terms of pricing. So we're seeing that increase. However, this is, in particular, I want to mention that this number is just an indicator to something that we're seeing happening. What a lot of experts are mentioning is that, yes, there is this rise. However, it may not be something that's going to reach that 24 trillion by 2040. There is a chance that this number, that the different solutions regarding new diseases that are coming up will find a different price point that is usually cheaper than what is currently in the market, and that number may go down. But again, the fact that spending in healthcare, both from government and private sector, is on the rise is quite worrying, and is something that we're looking into as a foundation. And finally, we just had a talk here about space. So this is something that, if you've attended the previous talk, that we do have the infrastructure for, that we do have the investment for, and that investment is increasing in this regard. So how can we then ultimately turn this sector into a viable economic sector that the UAE can choose? And ultimately, what we're seeing on a global scale is that the usage of this field as well is increasing, where we're seeing traditionally nations need to be superpowers to be able to impact the sector. Now we're seeing countries that are relatively small, like the UAE, are able to contribute on a regional scale, as well as private sectors, endeavors, people with the capital that are able to then create the investment for the sector and attract talent as a result. So let's look at the numbers. So we're seeing by 2030, so by almost 10 years, the number of satellites that are owned by private industry becoming in the thousands. So in my opinion, so this is what the a number of studies indicated, but in my opinion, that number will increase. It will be more, as the price point for sending a satellite decreases, that number could increase. So even from a government standpoint, when we look at this number, what should we do? Where we're seeing some companies such as, if I'm not mistaken, One Planet, that is sending nanosatellites that have the ability of larger satellites to capture photos. So usually this is something that was held by the defense departments of countries, is now in the hands of private sector. So when we talk about the different impacts that the private sector, which ultimately is trying to raise the capital, or is looking at it from a financial point of view rather than a utilitarian point of view, what should government's view be on this? There are many experiments happening around the world regarding this. However, should we be for it? If yes, what are different aspects that we should look for? You know, as the low Earth orbit is becoming sort of a playground for government, and government is now becoming adept at looking at beyond low Earth orbit, private sector is taking that role of leading the low Earth orbit, and in some aspects, some are even stating of trying to even get to beyond low Earth orbit, which is already an endeavor by its own. Another thing is we're seeing asteroid mining, which is something, again, spoke of in science fiction, become something more of a reality. Luxembourg was the first nation to have a policy regarding asteroid mining. Asteroid mining is expected to have the first trillionaire. As the person who will become the first trillionaire is someone who will mine asteroids. Asteroids have minerals that on Earth are very rare, and they're quite common in or on asteroids. So if someone wants to go and mine platinum, gold, silver, and bring them down to Earth, what will happen to the financial markets? We don't know, even though it is something that is quite plausible. There are about 2 to 5 million asteroids they're called near-Earth asteroids, where they're quite close relatively for our satellites to be able to go and grab them. Japan went to an asteroid and actually hit it with I think it was a chair-sized metal object just to see what would happen. And this is not the first time that humanity has reached an asteroid, but I think the second or third time. So when private sector enters this market, which already they have had, what will happen then to the way that the financial markets have been running along for centuries? And finally, as I mentioned, so you don't have to be a superpower to be able to enter the sector. However, those superpowers of the 21st century are now trying to take the lead from the United States and trying to lead the sector forward. They're saying we want to be on Mars by the 2040, and we want to do things that other nations couldn't. And we're seeing what may be a next space race, where we're seeing China, which has the fastest developing space sector in the world, trying to mine the moon for a specific element called helium-3, which is very rare on Earth, which allows for nations to have miniaturized nuclear reactors. So by doing so, it can have that lead when we talk about the new advancements in this sector. It has already landed in the far side of the moon, which no country has ever done that. So it's showing the world that it is not only talking the talk. Actually, they did not talk the talk. They just walked the walk, and we were surprised. So this is something that we're seeing today. And ultimately, when we look at the advancements of the space sector, it is, other than the fact that it requires new innovations, it requires a new type of imagination to be able to encompass and to be able to actually be able, for us at least in the UAE, to lead as well. So you heard me talk a lot, but thank you.
Saeed Gergawi, thank you, Saeed. Grab a seat. Thank you, Saeed. We don't have much time. There's obviously far too much to unpack to go through everything. So could we start with some basics? Because it seems to me that the strand of what you're doing, which is sort of blue sky thinking, if this is the technology that we have available now, which means we can predict what the technology we're going to have next is likely to be, which allows us to predict what outcomes we can possibly steer and aim for by way of mission objective. And I know that your previous job was working on the Emirates space program with a view to getting onto Mars in 2041 or 2141. Is that right?
So I worked on two programs, one that is launching next year,
right,
and one that is for the next 100 years.
Okay, right. So you know what you're talking about when you're thinking ahead a century from now about what might be required.
I hope so.
Can we bring it back to the first of your 3 chapter headings, so to speak, which, for all that we're looking at space exploration, mining asteroids, you've referenced Japan and China, so on and so forth, without us being able to solve or contain global warming, without us, and bear in mind that we first thought of global warming 40 years ago. The warnings were there over 40 years ago in the late 70s. We've had the Kyoto Agreement, the Paris Accord. We are still seeing these levels rising, which results in the supercyclone in Mozambique 24 hours ago. And with your predictive future proofing hat on, do you think we stand any chance of doing any of the technological stuff unless we solve the terrible problems we have with our planetary meteorology and climate change at the moment?
So what we're seeing is that there are already different developments that are happening and research efforts that are happening that are looking at this particular aspect. The issue is many of them are looking at it purely from an academic point of view and are not being tested on the ground. However, there are some even in the region, for example, that are testing. For example, the Biosaline Center in the UAE that is testing different types of quinoa that are grown in that can be grown in salty water. Again, the research is happening, but what we're noticing is the amount of research that are coming into market and is being available isn't happening fast enough. Another thing is, at the end of the day, this is a global effort. So everyone needs to be on the same page. And everyone needs to be in agreement. And that's where the harder part is. It's not on the technological aspect or the development and the research. That's happening whether we want it or not, but it's more on governments coming together and agreeing that this is an issue to challenge. And so with the Paris Accord, most everyone agreed, but it's on the next steps.
So everybody agreed, but very few people have done anything about it. And of course, it doesn't take a genius to work out that the United Arab Emirates is quite a low-lying country. A 2-degree rise, average rise in the global temperature will lead to between a 1 and 3 meter rise in sea levels, and that changes the nature of the UAE's geography quite fundamentally. That seems to be the elephant in the room that a lot of people are not talking about, because it is crucial for here in the UAE, as it is for the Maldives, for the Seychelles, for Hawaii, for the Great Barrier Reef, that we contain this problem soon.
Yes, so, and there are simulations that will show you as of today, in 2100, if this keeps happening, where is the new shorelines of different cities around the world? In Dubai, the shoreline will be somewhere in Zabil. In Zabil, which is, I think, 6 kilometers inland, 6 to 7 kilometers inland from where it is today. But what we're noticing is there isn't, at least in the UAE, there is that demand, there's that that need and that want for change, where we're seeing the largest solar park, we're seeing efforts like Masdar, but the issue is then it comes down to cultural aspects. Should I buy the next Nissan to go dune bashing versus... So it comes down to even cultural aspects that have been there for a while, and it's just, it's easy for technology to move forward, but people move at a much slower pace.
Right. To come to the second chapter of your fantastic speech, the interface between humanity, our species, and that which we create through robotics and artificial intelligence. I loved your illustration that well over 60% of Americans would be resistant to having an enhanced memory chip plugged to their brains, but Emiratis that you sampled would be very pro it. What do you ascribe that cultural difference to?
So the cultural aspect is that what we're seeing is in the UAE we have quite a culture of people adapting technology. Whether it was the demand for the Samsung's folding phone or the latest and newest technological product out there. But there isn't that, at least it's not being asked enough of the impact of these technologies. It's always, we are very reactive to them. In fact, the foundation that I work, the BioFuture Foundation, came up as a question, where it was an exhibition in the World Government Summit. There was an exhibit of a virtual doctor that you have in the in your restroom, and it just collects your information, and then you go on your daily routine. And government officials kept on asking, what happens to my data? This is back in 2013. And that's the reason for this whole entity rising, where we're seeing gradually that happening, but not fast enough, where people are saying, all right, if you will implement X, what will happen? What is the, so if you throw the stone into the pond, what are the ripple effects? Yeah. So there's that cultural aspect where we'll adopt it and then let's talk about it. Yeah. So again, however, you don't want to reach to a point where you want to restrict these aspects.
Okay, can you hang on to that thought for a second, Saeed, because that sort of feeds into my final question, which is about chapter 3, which loosely, forgive the awful paraphrasing, but introduces the idea of nanomedicine, nanotechnology used to enhance our biological, our own personal biospheres, which, as you say, is a possible outcome for medical, technological advance that is a benefit to humanity. Yeah. But there's a lot of resistance to it. So the way I'd like to address this question is, what is your view on the morality and the ethics that we bring to the decisions we take that either enhance humanity or enhance the technology? Because a lot of morality and ethics come from many centuries ago that were not designed to deal with these scenarios.
So when it comes to tackling this specific can of worms that he just opened, what happens is, at least for the UAE, there's the need for it has to happen on a phased out approach.
Right.
And one that is based on transparency. We experimented with this with the latest version of the Museum of the Future within the Government Summit, when we looked at Humans 2.0. If we took things like 3D printing, already as of 2 weeks ago, a miniature rabbit heart size was 3D printed. This is no longer science fiction, this is happening. So then when we look at, all right, what then happens, we try to investigate what would happen 20 years down the line when potentially this is looked at as something normal.
That we can 3D print
yes.
human organs for transport.
Yes. If you were to walk into a store, just like you would do in a clothing store, and say, all right, I want to 3D print a heart, a new heart. I'm getting sick of mine. I'm feeling a bit of palpitation. I want a heart that will give me 60 plus years. What happens to that? And what was interesting is we posed it to governments. And a lot of them had blank faces. Like, oh, this is interesting. And then we asked them the question, you as government officials from around the world, what are you going to do about it? This is already happening. And they went, oh, we need to look into it. So what was a bit scary for us was this is not looked at least from a serious point of view. And many of the different developments are happening in the academic aspect. So I guess that is a version of an answer for it.
Final quick question for me. Are you excited by the future or scared?
Cautiously excited.
Good answer. We have time for a couple of questions from the floor. Would anybody like to pose a question to Saeed Al-Gergawi, who is going to make our future bright for us? Please. Thank you. Thank you, Moria, very much.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk through the next 50 years or the potential of what could happen. I was surprised that in the US, a large majority of people were against the idea of having brain implants to help their memory. And did you carry out research here to see, or were you saying that it was not, you couldn't carry out that same research to see how people felt here about brain implants to enhance memories?
So we didn't carry out the study here, but we run a lot of work for government entities, and we all try to what's another good word for it? Try to just lay out the future, and we just ask them. So this is happening around the world. What, as government officials, what do you think? And they say, oh, they joke. It's sometimes it's taken as a joke, where oh, it'll be nice if I could remember things, la la, so my wife won't bother me, la la. But what's interesting is the appetite for it is there. Obviously, it needs to be more run on a scientific and academic basis before we can then have a proper opinion to relate to or compare to with the US.
And the question at the back, gentleman at the back in the white shirt, please. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Saeed, for enlightening us. For a common person like us, it's not as thing as you might be seeing the future. For us, sometimes it becomes scaring. So I'll just ask from that perspective, more of artificial intelligence, more of robotics, particularly in medical science, what purview we get that probably tomorrow robots should be doing operations, everything. So how you see the human relevance 30 years down the line, whether human relevance are squeezing or something which we need to do in order to become relevant or to drive it, what exactly as a common person we need to look into it and find for ourselves?
That's a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. See, the human aspect is always going to be relevant. And what's interesting is I'd recommend you to look at jobs that are quote unquote immune to automation and AI. And what's interesting is the job that will not be impacted by artificial intelligence and by automation is nursing. This is a job that is primarily run by females. Men have, I think a 5% share of the whole industry. So when we look at that type of job and what that job caters for, it's more on dealing with humans. There's a more nurturing aspect that we're seeing robots will not have, at least for the next 50 years or so. And that is where we're seeing many of the different developments or different, I'd say, views in terms of human / machine relations. Is that the human aspect will always be there. It's just it will be playing more of a collaborative role, where we're seeing roles of robot human translators that are translating human emotions to robots, all the way to things like nursing that are very human in essence as a field.
Thank you, Saeed. So we need to teach our grandchildren, male or female, to be nurses. It may be the only job available to them in 100 years' time. Saeed doesn't have a book, but if you'd like to join him at the signing stand outside, if you have questions for him or you want to ask about the Dubai Future Academy or the Dubai Future Foundation, would that be right? If people want to come and have a chat with you? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Shukran, Saeedati wa Sardati, and thank you so much to Saeed Al-Gergawi.